Good congregation. There was about, I think they said about 11 churches represented at the conference.
It was.
About 11. So all the way from Hawaii, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, of course Washington, California. Thank you very much. So yeah, it was a good turnout and everything. And I looked out at the crowd, and I said, I looked at the because we're at the conference community center. I said at one time we could all fit in the old landmark church building. It's not true anymore, is it?
I would imagine there was at least 50 there.
Oh, it's probably more than that.
Yeah.
It was probably more than that.
I was just impressed. It was a good crowd.
At least, I would say probably 65, 70. Yeah. With the little kids and stuff too. But yeah, there's just no way we could have all fit in there anymore. Which is good. It just means the conference has been gaining steam, and like you said, it is a nice shot in the arm. Well, if you'll go with me over to, we all know that we're in John, and if you've been keeping score, you'll know that we're in John chapter 10. But I do want to go to Matthew. Bible switch gears. Sorry about that. Matthew chapter 22. We're going to try to understand, at least this helps me to understand, and I hope it helps you to understand. Maybe you have it all figured out and I'm just the oddball, but it helps me to understand exactly where John chapter 10 is coming from. Now, if I say John chapter 10, what pops into your mind? There's some chapters and verses or chapters and books that kind of go together that you're like, oh yeah, I got that. Or that sounds familiar. Like 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection. Or we think of John chapter 3, the new birth. Or we think of Revelation chapter 11, talking about the second coming of Christ, or Matthew 24. But when I say John 10, usually that triggers some sort of, oh yeah moment.
Good shepherd.
The Good Shepherd. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about that today, but in order for me to understand the Good Shepherd references, you first have to understand what Jesus was up against at the time. And that was a lot of bad leadership. There was a lot of bad leadership going on at the time. We're going to see here, and before we get to John chapter 10, I want to set the stage and look at Matthew 22. Like I said, this helps me to understand what Jesus was talking about, and even if he just wanted to come and say those things, that's wonderful, but what setting was that put in? What setting was he up against? What situation was he up against that would just make that much more contrast? That he is a good shepherd, and that he leads us. Well, this is Matthew 22. Matthew 22 is interesting because you had your three major groups of people that were in opposition to Jesus. You had the scribes, you had the Pharisees, and you had Sadducees. Usually the scribes and lawyers kind of went together. They're the ones writing down the law and all that, studying the law. But then you had the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so we see all three groups attack Jesus in this same chapter. And Matthew records it for us in 22, verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men. So right away, what's the scripture say? They're trying to entangle him in his talk. So what's one of the first tactics that you use? It's flattery. They're trying to butter him up, and they're trying to say, we're harmless. We're on your side, Jesus, because, well, you don't just flatter somebody unless you're a nice guy, right? Well, it says that they wanted to entangle him in his talk. And so the question that they wanted to ask him was supposed to entangle him in his talk. Was supposed to get him to either say one thing or the other. It was supposed to trick him. They were trying to trick Jesus that day. And good luck with that. Okay? You're not going to trick Jesus. And these people, if they hadn't found that out, which clearly they hadn't, they're going to find out you can't trick Jesus. And so they start off with flattery. we know that you're true. You teach the way of God in truth. And you don't care about anybody. You don't, there isn't anybody that can, buddy up to you and get in with you, and then you just protect them even though they're wrong. You're not going to show favoritism. You're a perfect judge, is what they're saying. It says, you don't regard the person of men. It says, tell us therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So he could run with this one of two ways. In their mind, they're thinking, we got him on this one. Because, one, he's going to say, yeah, let's do everything Rome tells us to do. I'm completely a puppet of Rome. And if Rome says stop worshiping in the temple, we're going to stop doing that. So he's either all the way that way, or he's going to say, no, don't pay taxes to Rome. And they're going to say, well, we got you. What would they do at that moment? They would say, you're saying you're not supposed to pay taxes to Rome. Or that sounds like some of these other leaders that have come along in the past and tried to overthrow Rome. And the Jews try to overthrow Rome or try to be independent again. So they figured that he's going to go one of two ways. And either way, they got it. They can show that he's a puppet of Rome, or they can show that he's a rebel who needs to be put to death. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why do you test me, hypocrites? Why are you doing this? It's pointless. So he says, show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, give therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. He took the best of both worlds. I'm a puppet of Rome, I don't care about God when it comes right down to it. No. I'm going to pay to Caesar, but I'm not going to overthrow Rome either. I'm going to bring what's God's and what's Caesar's and let them mix perfectly. Don't we do the same? Do we just go out in Garfield County, Montana, and license plate 50, and say, I'm going to just buck the system, I don't want to pay taxes, I'm going to overthrow the government, and all. No, we're not supposed to do that. So Jesus came to show a better way. And so he took, this is a perfect answer, because he says God deserves what God gets, and Rome deserves what Rome gets. They're the ruling power. And so it was no accident that Rome was in power at the time, and Jesus says, we're not going to overthrow Rome. We're not going to do everything they do, but we're not going to overthrow them. So he took those two ideas and he arranged it perfectly. So when they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. Just couldn't believe the answer, and so they just went away. Well, next up to bat is the Sadducees. It says, the same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother should marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now we're going to get into the hypothetical. This situation really ever happened? I don't know. It says, now there were with us 7 brothers, and the first died after he had married, having no offspring, left his wife to his brother, so that he could raise up offspring in his brother's name, and right, that's the idea. Likewise, the second also, and the third, even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died also. Well, whose wife of the 7 is she going to be, for they all had her as wife? In the resurrection. What he says? Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? We all have our pet questions that, it's like if God can do anything, can he make a boulder so heavy you can't carry it? I mean, just dumb stuff like that, right? But that's the question that a lot of people have in their hearts when you go to witness to them or whatever, is they just have this pet question. I worked with a guy that had a pet question, and it was, well, if God created everything, who created God? That was his question, and he was stuck on that. And we talked about that, and he brought that up on more than one occasion. He's trying to challenge me and saying, well, this is my question I have for every Christian that I ask. If God created everything, who created God? And at first I told him, I said, nobody. But then he's like, well, that doesn't make sense. So he's stuck on that. Well, this was the Sadducees' pet question that they had just in their back pocket, waiting for anyone to challenge them about the resurrection. This was it. And undoubtedly, they got a lot of people on this. Because they would get tangled up in their words and tangled up in the question, and because they had a limited amount of knowledge, but who has the ultimate knowledge? Jesus was able to give them a real answer, knowing both sides of this life and the next. Jesus answered and said to them, "You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God." See, all you have to do is look at the Scriptures for the resurrection. It says, "For in the resurrection they neither marry." Here's the part where you're mistaken. And then I'll tell you about the power of God, I'll tell you about the Scriptures. Here's where you're mistaken. You assume that they are going to be marrying in the resurrection after everything is said and done. Well, you're mistaken in that. They're not going to be they're not going to be married and giving in marriage. They're going to be like the angels of God in heaven. There's a window that only Jesus could provide. But he said, go look in your Bibles, and we'll talk about where you're wrong as far as the Scriptures. He says, "But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living." And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. He's 2 for 2. He keeps knocking them out of the park. It's like when, Michael Jordan hit his 6th three-pointer in a row. He just goes, "I don't know what to do. I'm so good." It goes like that. I'm amazing myself, But Jesus, you come up to bat against him, and you're going to lose. These people didn't understand that they're challenging the Son of God, and he has the answers. And for them to even think that they could try was foolhardy. So far he's silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, now verse 34. "But when the Pharisees heard," actually in verse 16 it says the Herodians. So the Herodians apparently were another teacher or group that he silenced. "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him." So he's not just asking a question, he's testing him and saying, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." That was his answer. And undoubtedly he silenced him that day, testing him. Well, there was no response. He silenced him again. So verse 41, it's Jesus' turn now. While the Pharisees were gathered together, why do you think they were gathered together? They're getting ready to ask him another question. They're getting ready to stump him. Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "Well, he's the son of David." He said, "Well, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. When you lose that many times, and it's not just a silent loss, it's in front of the crowds, you get a little skittish. So skittish that they just gave up. So what did they do? Eventually they turned to Judas Iscariot and said, "Look, we can't defeat this guy in the open. We have to get him some other way." And that other way was paying off one of his apostles to turn him in, to let him know where Jesus would be so that they could send temple guards out and arrest him. They took the coward way out. So in 23, it just makes a little more sense when we read the words of Jesus talking about the leadership after reading 22. Chapter 23, verse 1 says, "Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and his disciples, saying, The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do." Now it's his turn to call them out, isn't it? It's Jesus' turn now to turn the tables and really expose the Pharisees for who they were. Do you think anybody did this at the time? Do you think anybody was really daring enough to go against the establishment the leadership? I don't think so. But Jesus was. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear, lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move one of them with their little fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garment. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats at the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But to you do not be called a rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. It says, and do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. He could have stopped right there. And let them figure out the rest of it. He says, do you really observe the Pharisees humbling themselves and being your servant? That's what we're called to do. We're called to be each other's servants. And that means that we're not above each other, you know. This is what the Pharisees had in mind. This is the way that other churches are set up. With the big I's and the little U's. It's not the way it was supposed to be with Jesus. He said, when Jesus himself got down and washed the disciples' feet, I mean, that says it all right there.
Yeah.
That says it all. You really don't even need to put more words to that.
Well, I was just going to say that when they asked him what was the greatest commandment, and he laid it out there, this is the greatest commandment. And then in verse 37, and then he proceeded to put on display in front of everybody how they were not meeting this either commandment, the first or the second commandment. And I just kind of jotted down next to verse 37, with all your heart and soul and mind. And so I wrote, well, heart, that would be maybe perhaps motives, okay, the internal, right? Soul would be probably maybe the external works and service, you know, your life, okay? And then mind would be your thoughts, okay? And so with these three areas, they asked him, and Jesus said, in these three areas, you demonstrate the first commandment, and the second, love your neighbors yourself. Then what you just read in 23 is exactly what they were not doing. They were binding burdens on these men and not lifting them with their own fingers. Okay, that's not loving your neighbor as yourself, right? Okay, and then they were, you know, not performing the works as they should have. So with their solar lives, they were not following through with this. Okay, and so it really is. He's breaking down now how that they had missed the mark on these first two great commandments.
And so, you know, Jesus keeps going on, and specifically calling them out, and we can kind of summarize. But he's saying that they washed the outside of the tomb, and it looks great, but inside are dead man's bones. He said that's just like the Pharisees. And the leadership at the time was, they were just gross on the inside, but on the outside they look great. And so, let's just see, verse 24. It says blind guides. Blind guides. What else did he say about that? He said if the blind leads the blind, they both fall into the ditch. And he says your leadership now is blind. And they're both falling into the ditch. So the ones that are following the blind guide, you're not supposed to have a blind guide, you're supposed to have they don't have a blind seeing dog or a helper for a blind person, right? What would be the point of that? So you have a dog who can see and he can smell and he can move around and he can get around and warn that person, stop that person, bark when it's necessary or whatever to help that person. But if they're blind, and like he says here in 24, blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. The blind leading the blind, both will fall into the ditch. And so Jesus called the leadership out because of incidents like chapter 22, where they just kept hitting him with all these things that, you know, they try to just degrade him in front of everybody. Jesus didn't put up with it. He calls them hypocrites, he calls them vipers. Verse 33 says, serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. Who does that sound like? Sounds like Saul of Tarsus to me. Did he go from city to city? Wasn't he a Pharisee? that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. It says, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So, what we see is that, contrast the blind leadership at the time. Let's go to John chapter 10. And you're going to see quite a stark contrast between the leadership and the good shepherd. Because both are leaders, wouldn't you agree? Weren't the Pharisees in place to lead the people? Weren't they in place to guide the people, teach the people, the lawyers and the scribes? They were responsible for the people's spirituality. They were responsible for keeping them separate. They were responsible for guiding them. And if it starts with, if the leadership is off, people are going to be off. And it takes someone like Jesus to come along and say, wait a minute, that's not the way it's supposed to be. I'll show you the way it's supposed to be, is what he says in chapter 10. He says, most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So I picture that this is some sort of like barn, excuse my ignorance of living animals. I prefer the dead kind that are packaged. So, very tasty on the grill.
Skinned and flayed.
Yes. Will not let my kids tell me what's inside a hot dog. I don't want to know. Ignorance is bliss. So, what he's saying is that I picture some sort of barn, area. He said, excuse my ignorance. Well, what I can picture is what Jesus is saying, that the sheep are now inside, sheltered, right, for the night. And the only way inside of that structure, legally, is the door. And if you're not a very upright person, and you have intentions of harming the sheep, of killing them, of stealing them, you're not going to use the door. Because the doorkeeper's right there. And the doorkeeper says, nope, I don't, that little shutter thing, nope, I don't recognize you, shut the door. Bolt it a couple times, right? Well, he's going to find some other way into the sheepfold. He's going to break a window. He's going to go around back. He's going to try everything he can do to get into that area where the sheep are scattered. But the shepherd, way opposite of that, comes in and they open the door, and the doorkeeper, yep, you're the right guy for the job. Come on in. And he comes in, and all he has to do is just call. And they hear his voice, and they recognize it. What voice do we listen to? What voice have we been trained to lead, to go? It's the voice of the Spirit. And so sometimes when life gets really, really loud, we have to turn down the volume so that we can hear the voice that's still there.
Amen.
That's
so true.
We all get caught up in that. We all get caught up in that. It's so easy for the world to get so loud. We just have to turn the volume back down and say, Lord, I'm dialing it back a little bit. Talk to me. What do you want me to do? So to him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and they follow him, for they know his voice. What a beautiful picture. Beautiful picture. And sheep are really dumb, right?
Very dumb.
Okay, we have a first-hand witness, verified witness. When you buy something on Amazon, verified owner. Okay, this person knows what they're talking about. They're not just trolling some product. They verified purchaser of sheep right here. I've seen it. She says they're very dumb, which means they're dumb. Okay, but what they do know is the voice of their master. They understand that. We don't really shepherds, and we don't really rely on them for food and all that. We have supermarkets for that. But back then, if you were a shepherd, those sheep, they had to follow you. And if one went astray, like Jesus talks about in the parable, that sheep's in danger. Come and get the sheep back, put it back in the fold where it's protected. And so when he brings out his own sheep, He goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. We're compared to a sheep. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. We should be fleeing from the voice of the strangers. We should be fleeing from that. From the voice that tells us to go this way when we know that's not the right way to go. We have two, always have two options, at least. We can follow the Spirit, or we can follow the world. Jesus says, listen to that voice that you know, that you understand. It feels familiar. That's the voice that we should listen to. Well, Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to them. So he's going to put it a different way. Then Jesus said to them again, most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All whoever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. So they were inside protected, all the elements and everything, and they go out to go feed, and they come back in. But all the while, the shepherd is there, watching the sheep. What a beautiful picture. But the shepherd, there's no question that the shepherd knows better than the sheep know. The sheep just kind of go along with the flow. Yeah, they can hear the voice, they know that. And that's about all they know. They're protected as long as they hear that voice. Sometimes that's all we need to know in life, is that we're protected as long as we hear his voice. Sometimes we don't have the answers. We don't need all the answers. But we know that when we hear his voice, that we're protected. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to get them to see. Look, all the other leaders that you've had, they're leading you astray. They're blind guides. They're falling into the ditch. They're the ones who are challenging me, the ones who aren't following God. And so he tells them, he's the door of the sheep. And you're going to, in verse 11, well, in verse 10, it says, the thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. They don't regard the life of the sheep. It says, I have come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Not just protect. Anyone can put a roof over your head, right? But have that life more abundantly. You mean there's more to life than just protection and food? There's way more to life than that. And that's what he came to do. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. What shepherd out there would give his life for the sheep? I'm talking about a physical shepherd. One that really cares for them. Jesus is saying, I'm the good shepherd. He says, but a hireling, a hired man who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hired man flees because he is a hired man and does not care about the sheep. It's like substitute at school. Man, I love substitutes. I get an amen from anyone.
Yeah.
The substitute didn't know what was going on. You knew they didn't know the rules. You knew that they didn't know the goof-offs in the class. They were going to act up, and that was a fun day when the sub came.
They knew the goof-offs at the end of the day, didn't they?
Oh, they knew them. They certainly did know. But the sub, they don't have the same beat on the class. They don't have the tendencies down, the kids are going to do this or that. They don't have the knowledge. And I quite frankly don't think they care as much. Because the next day they could go be subbing across town in some other class. Are they going to put as much effort? Are they going to put 100% into that class? I don't think so. They're not really vested in that class like the teacher is from day one. And consequently, the kids knew that, so they goofed off. But Jesus is saying, the hired man, as soon as he sees danger, he's going to leave. Jesus didn't leave. Jesus saw danger approaching, coming of his crucifixion. He didn't bail. He didn't say, I'm out of here. Sheep, you're going to be scattered, and I'm just going to not go through with this. Because persecution did come. His arrest, it did come. And what did he do? He went through with it, is what he did. He says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them I also must bring, that they will hear, and they will hear my voice, and they will be one flock as a shepherd. There's your precursor to a prediction of folding in the Gentiles. The sheep that aren't of the fold of Israel, going to be the Gentiles. It says, therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I've received from my Father. That means that his Father commanded him to lay his life down. That's why when in the garden, the night that he was struggling with this, he says, not my will, but yours. And what was his will? To go through with laying his life down. He didn't stop short. He didn't say no. He followed through with what the command was. Therefore there was a division among the Jews because of these sayings. And many of them said, he has a demon and is mad. He's just crazy. Why are you even listening to him? Others said, these are not the words of him, of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Just put it all together and say, this man is not a demon. He is a good man. He has good things to say. And either he's going to have a demon and he's insane, or he's righteous and he's of God. There's no in between. Jesus did not let any gray, there's no gray area with him. Either he's the Christ, and he said, and other people are saying he's mad. He's one or the other. Some people, they continue to believe that he was insane, is what my footnote says. Not right. And other people believe that he was the Christ.
I was just going to say, it's funny how different people can look at the same person and have a different read on that person's entire demeanor and mission or purpose or whatever, everything about them. We see that today in politics. Different people are divided over the candidates, and some see the candidate's track record. Okay, they had Jesus' track record. Can anyone open the eyes of the blind? He was laying down a track record that some people were honestly looking at, okay, considering, and then others are just blind. This guy's crazy. Well, they saw the same track record, but their perception of it was different. You can look at someone's history, things they've done before as they become a candidate for the president of this country. Some people just choose to ignore all that. They're blind, so we can see how that happens in real time, real life. We see how this division occurred, looking at the same Jesus.
Right. It's the same evidence. Some people come out of it saying we evolved from goop, and some people say we evolved, not evolved, but we came from the Creator. Same evidence.
Same evidence. Yeah.
Same evidence. And so, verse 22, I'm going to try to get through chapter 10. We don't have much more to go. It says, now it was the feast of the dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. They just weren't willing to give up. The Jews surrounded him. I mean, really? I guess my question is, do they have anything better to do?
Didn't they have jobs?
It's like these protesters.
Yeah.
There are, and I kid you not, there are professional protesters.
Yes, they are.
They travel a circuit and they just grab onto an idea and they protest against it.
Paid for by the government.
Wow, get a life, people.
Yeah.
It's okay to be against something, but the way that we go about it, Verse 24, then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, how long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Plainly. Well, you got to be careful when you ask God to do that. You got to be careful, because we might be sticking our foot in our mouths when you ask God to say something plainly. I've been telling you this whole time, you haven't been listening, is the answer I get. Hello, you know, how thick is that skull? Tell us plainly if you're the Christ. Just come out and say it. Really? Jesus answered them, I told you, and you do not believe. Go ahead. I think it's like Jeannie. Hi there. She disconnected. She's back now.
Okay.
Jesus answered them, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. It says, my works are speaking so loudly that you can't hear what I'm saying. Pointing to the works. But you do not believe because you are not of my sheep. As I said to you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Saying, you're not listening to me, you don't believe me because we don't have a relationship. There's no relationship there. You haven't responded to the things that I've been saying because you don't want to. And remember, people do what they want, ultimately. And if you don't want to believe, you're going to come up with every excuse to not believe. He says, you don't believe because you're not of my sheep. As I said to you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. It's a very safe place to be. In the fold of Christ, in the church, a very, very safe place to be. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my hand. It says, I and my Father are one. About a very controversial statement to people who don't believe. It's just going to anger them. But he said it anyway. And the Jews took up stones again to stone him. They're going to kill him. Jesus answered them, many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of these works do you stone me? The Jews answered him, saying, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy. And because you, being a man, make yourself God. How dare he? Who were they looking for to come as the Messiah? What kind of person were they expecting? Were they expecting just a man to come deliver them from their sins and set them free and set up the kingdom? Was that just going to be a human being? I think what they had a problem with was Jesus. Not the office necessarily of the Christ, of the Messiah. But they had a problem with Jesus. And Jesus had to tell them, as he says here, well, let's just skip down, because we're going to get down to the other verse. But let's skip to verse 37. He says, if I do not do the works of my Father, don't believe me. You're off the hook. That means nobody really important sent me. I just really did come from Nazareth. My parents are Mary and Joseph. My brothers, you know my brothers, you know where I'm from. All these other things. Don't even believe me. If I'm not doing the works that I said I'm doing. But is that the case? He says, but if I do, it says, though you do not believe me, you're not believing Jesus, believe in the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. So believe the witness that I have, believe the testimony, believe the miracles, and believe that only somebody from the Father could actually do those things. So he's saying, take off the blinders and understand what other people are understanding, and that is, nobody else could do these things unless he were Christ. Well, I skipped those other verses. Let's read them. So Jesus deals with their being flabbergasted that a man could make himself God. Goes along with Pastor's devotion this morning. It says, Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? We've done a study on this before. If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and the scripture can't be broken, do you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because I said, I am the Son of God? Jesus made that statement, I am the Son of God. I'm blaspheming? When in the Old Testament, David, in the Psalms, I believe, talks about people and saying that they're gods, lowercase g. Now, I'm not talking about what the Mormons believe and You're gonna be God and go and inherit your own planet and populate it with lots of kids. I'm not talking about that. They've taken that idea from these scriptures and they've twisted it. No, he's saying if you are going to live in an elevated life one day, and the word for that he used is God's, why would it be such a stretch for the Son of God to be the Son of God? Why would it be a stretch for him who's talking to you to be deity? When your hope is to be and have an elevated life in the kingdom, have a glorified body, and all the things that go along with that. To take on divinity, isn't that what Pastor said this morning? To take on that divine nature. If that's your goal, why is it a stretch for Jesus to already have done that? So he says, why do you think I'm blaspheming because I said I'm the Son of God? There had to be somebody that fits that bill, and it's Jesus. Well, they didn't like what he had to say again. And so therefore they sought again to seize him, but he escaped out of their hand. Remember, they had surrounded him. It's not his time yet. He just escaped. How he did it, we don't know. Why he did it, we know. But how he did it, we don't know. How did he keep escaping the wrath of the Jews? Every time that he turned around, there was wrath. And they wanted to arrest him. But it goes back to what he says in verse 17. Verse 18, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of myself. Which means that they weren't going to grab him that day, hold him down, or start throwing stones at him and kill him. No, because that wouldn't be him giving up his life. That would be them taking him. And that's not what Jesus allowed. He had a time, and he's going to stick to the time. Like Philip's been saying in the Wednesday night studies, it didn't happen. Jesus hasn't come back this time. He's got a date. He's sticking to it. No one's going to deviate that. Same thing. Verse 40 says, and he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was baptizing at first. And there he stayed. Now he's just getting out of Dodge. It's just too much. It's too much. He's gone toe to toe with the Pharisees, and now he needs some space. Then many came to him and said, John performed no sign, but all the things that John spoke about this man were true. And many believed in him there. They got away from the leaders, they got away from the hubbub and all the distractions. They said, we're going to go out to Jesus, and we're going to seek him, and we're going to believe in him. It took effort on their part. They did. So that's what I love about the scriptures, is that even though there's so much opposition and so much anger and hostility from some crowd, from some of the people, there's always those some that get it. And there's always those some that say, this is who I want. This is what I want. And I believe it. Haven't we believed it? Isn't this what we want? The light doesn't turn on for everybody. It's turned on for us. We need to keep it turned on. All right, does anybody have anything else?
Yeah.
Let's go to dismiss.